Well, hello from the NASPA office in Washington, D.C. I hope everyone is enjoying Careers and Student Affairs Month. My name is Jasmine Scott. I'm Assistant Director of Member Engagement, working with student and new professional initiatives at NASPA. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's SAM webinar. I like my grits with butter and sugar, rewriting the narrative of resilience for people of color in student affairs, with Kirby Gibson and Caress Gillespie from Syracuse University. Before we get started with today's formal presentation, I'd like to review some of the technical aspects of today's program.
It's just easier so that you won't have to
First, at this time, if you want to minimize any other applications you may have up, that way you can hear and see our presentation today. This webinar will last about 60 minutes and we'll save some time at the end to answer any questions that you have. You should currently be able to hear my voice using your phone or computer speakers and view a PowerPoint slide on your screen. On your screen, you should see a gray menu, likely on the right-hand side. This menu is going to allow you to access the audio control panel, which defaults to being open when you log into GoToWebinar. If this is not open for you, you can click the plus sign next to the word audio to expand that menu. You are able to join via a telephone or your computer's mic and speakers. Feel free to switch through both options during your presentation if your current method stops working for you. To use your telephone, you'll want to use the unique access code and PIN located on your menu. The code in the PowerPoint slide is just an example, so please don't try to dial that one in. It will have all attendees muted throughout the session. Next is that today's session is being live captioned, so to access the captions, you'll need to visit our external caption site, captiontext.com. That link was emailed out to attendees this morning, and it's also available in the chat box now. Alternatively, you can log into captiontext.com and enter our code 342-1301. And if you're having issues with that, feel free to put it in the questions tab below, and I'll get back to you with that link. If you do have a question or comment throughout the presentation, you'll be able to send it in to our presenters using the questions box located further down on your menu. Access this menu by clicking on the plus sign next to the word questions. And again, I'll share your questions with the presenters throughout the session, and we'll save some time at the end to respond to those. In case the menu starts to get in your way, you can hide it by clicking on the orange arrow at the very top of the vertical strip of icons that hangs out there on the side of your menu. If you need to get back to it to ask a question or to give feedback, go ahead and click on it again, and it will slide back out. And finally, for those of you who are tweeting, feel free to use our hashtag CSAM17, that's CSAM17, and I will now turn this over to our presenters, Kirby and Caress.
But I sent her with whole Joseph this morning.
All righty. Hello, everybody. I'm saying hello, like people can like respond back.
Yeah, Kirby, yeah, Caress.
We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. We know how busy it can be, but we are excited to engage with you around this conversation. I think this is something that Kirby and we've been kind of having some side conversations about, and so really hope that we can really get some new perspectives and your questions around this topic. And so I like my grits with butter and sugar. I do like my grits with butter and sugar.
I actually like my grits with butter and salt, sometimes cheese. You can go ahead and throw some catfish and some shrimp on there if you want to go ahead and get like Creole on us, but we'll leave the great grit debate for another time.
Yes. So let's jump right into talking about what does really kind of thinking about grit in the metaphysical world of in the terms of resilience for people of color, particularly in student affairs, and really talking about our goal for this presentation really is to think about where are these messages around resilience and grit are, and kind of some themes, because there's not really a definition within kind of our profession, our work, that really applies to us. And so we really tried to think about how do we collect this information and think about how do we apply this as practitioners.
And also thinking about too that resilience is definitely something in our work as practitioners within higher education and student affairs, and thinking about how the narrative of resilience is being shared across our field. Oftentimes not in the most either positive light or in the correct light, so to speak. So we hope that you are ready for this ride that we're about to go on. And let's go ahead and get started. So allow us to introduce ourselves.
My name is Caress Nicole Gillespie. I am an assistant director at Syracuse University. I've been at Syracuse for the last 9 years, working in residence life, particularly kind of supervising some of the residential communities and the professional staff here.
And my name is Kirby Raya Gibson. I am the Residence Director for the STEM Residential College here at Syracuse University. I've been serving as an RD. This is year 3 for me now. And so I'm really just engaging with our students, particularly those who are interested in majoring in STEM disciplines and being able to support them along their journeys. And so one of the things that we actually included also on our introductions are our Twitter accounts. So feel free to follow us at Just Caress and then at KRGibson89. We'll also be using this as a back channel to address any other questions and things that may come along, or comments or concerns. And so once we're actually done with the webinar, we'll come back and address whatever you all have to say via the Twitterverse.
Mm-hmm. So jumping right in, we want to really kind of talk about what we want to cover today. And so really, as I kind of talked about, we really tried to think about resiliency and grit and try to capture some of the themes we found in some of the definitions of resiliency and grit and their relation for people of color in student affairs and higher education.
Yeah. And then we also want to reflect on our own assumptions, biases, and positionality in relation to resilience and grit, and recognizing that we all don't start off at the same place. We all have our own unique journeys that impacts the way in which we navigate this thing that we call life and the way in which we show up, particularly thinking about the ways in which we show up in our work as practitioners.
Hey, Kirby Caress, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your screen right now, and I know you all do have slides. Do you mind sharing your screen for us?
Yeah.
Oh.
Can you? All right. Can you see it now?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to respond to Kiki.
Can y'all see it now?
Because like, so
I'm still not seeing anything. If you click on that 4th button, you should have the option. You see like the triangle like play button show screen. There's like a little caret, and it'll let you show what screen. So maybe it's just populating the wrong screen for us right now.
Or if it did get that, I don't know. I just need on this morning.
It says change. All right. It keeps going back to this other screen. All right, can you see it now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right,
great.
There we go.
I apologize.
So, you know, some technical difficulties along the way. So we were talking about our learning outcomes as it relates to this presentation. And so the first one being just acknowledging the different definitions that comes up around resiliency and grit, particularly themes that are around these particular words and its relation to people of color in student affairs and higher ed. We also talked about this piece of being mindful of the assumptions and biases, as well as our positionality in relation to resilience and grit, and what that means in terms of how we show up to spaces, given that we are navigating this thing called life, and recognizing that we all have different journeys, we start off at different places, etc.
And kind of thinking about just how do we take resiliency and grit and use the kind of framework of liberatory consciousness to approach it, and as our work as people of color, and thinking about creating space and creating a new way to think about how do we capture, communicate, and further these thoughts and messages around resiliency and grit for ourselves and others. And so we really tried to rethink that and turn it on its head a little bit. And so we hope that you can kind of engage in that journey with us and try to think about this new approach.
Yep. All right, and so we actually ask you all to engage with us. And so if you all could go to slido.com and then using the code CSAM17, we have a question for you all. And so I'm gonna go ahead and populate that on my screen. Hopefully you all can still see it. And so the question is, what comes to mind when you think about resilience and grit? And so join us again at slido.com and then using the code CSAM17. And then that's on your through mobile device and whatnot. And go ahead and type your responses and they should go ahead and populate on screen. Perseverance. folks are probably still getting together with the interwebs. Oh, woo. Rebound, ability, status quo, difficulties, grace,
tenacity,
professionalism, toughness, pain, self-care, community, anzandua,
fall,
we shall overcome,
wealth, struggle,
standing, framework,
athletes,
pushing through, strength, in quotes, grace and professionalism being this big thing that's coming up. All right. Doing the unexpected.
How do you recover? Getting the job done.
Obstacles. Commitment, asset, accountability. ESPN, I think I saw. All right. Cool. Emotional labor. No other option, no matter what.
Bounce back.
Stubbornness. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all so much for sharing. Feel free to continue to contribute to this space. It actually, what's nice about the Slido app, it'll populate all these answers for us into this word cloud, as you all see, that we can definitely reference back at the end of our presentation. So, hopefully you all can still see our screen.
So a lot of what you said are kind of some of the things that we found when we were looking at kind of what resiliency and grit means, right? So as I talked about before, there really isn't definitions or kind of frameworks that are grounded within student affairs or higher education. So we had to draw upon a lot of different disciplines, particularly within psychology, within business, a lot of different disciplines to think about what this means. And so one of the common themes we found was this idea of adversity and luck. And so really focusing on hardships and overcoming obstacles, kind of this idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And as we started to uncover and think about this theme, we found this article from recently, 2016, kind of a study around Black people and their resiliency in comparison to white people, and the this kind of proposal or notion that Black people are more resilient than whites. And this is a direct quote from the article, and kind of said that Black people are more resilient than white people because of the white people lack resilience because their lack of preparedness and experience with previous stressors that may place whites at the highest risk of poor outcomes when life gets out of control. Minority groups, on the other hand, have consistently lived under economic and social adversities, which given them firsthand experience and ability to believe that they can handle the stressors. For Blacks, a stressor is anything but new. They have mastered their coping skills. And so when we read this, we were really kind of similar to Oprah, like, where did this come from? And so this notion that kind of this hardship is a constant and this adversity is just a state of being for, particularly in this article, it said Black people, but in kind of thinking about just people of color in general, a narrative, what does this mean? And how do we think about this when we talk about resiliency? And if this is just expected, how do we challenge that a little bit?
And essentially, it pretty much is talking about this piece of, because you faced adversity or struggle, that is the reason why we are able to persevere. And so essentially, people, particularly white people, try to justify or validate our successes based on our racial identity, or these perceptions that because you are a person of color, you immediately have lower social economic status, you immediately have gone through, like you have just gone through, and they don't essentially attribute our successes to the hard work and dedication that was put in. And so one of the things that I immediately think about is in Shonda Rhimes' book, Year of Yes. She talks about this piece of how folks would always ask her, as a POC or as a Black woman, how does it feel to insert said accomplishment? And one of the things that she essentially says in her book is, so here's the tip. The answer, no matter how you fill in the blank, is always the same. I do not know. Since I've never been anything other than a Black woman, I can't tell you how specifically anything feels any more than someone could tell you how things feel as a white woman. It's a creepy question. Stop asking it. And so part of that, it is also assuming too that we are lucky. And so this idea that everything that we got was something that was attributed to luck. And when you think about this as it relates in the workplace, how particularly in higher education and student affairs, this piece of being tokenized and this idea that like, oh, so you are the sole Black woman or the sole person of color in your department to do said accomplishment.
And so, yeah, I think.
And so as a way to counteract that notion of luck, one of the things that we want to say is that, like, no, Shonda actually says is, no, I am not lucky. You know what I am? I am smart. I am talented. I take advantage of the opportunities that come my way. And I work really, really hard. Don't call me lucky. Call me a badass.
And so thinking about this idea of working hard, that brings us to another kind of common theme within this idea of resiliency, and kind of this other kind of term that's often used in tandem with resiliency, and it's grit. And so grit is really kind of focusing on this hard work, perseverance, and this effort to be successful. And so grit is something that is really, I would say, a new term kind of thrown in with this kind of language of resiliency, really, I guess, kind of pushed forward by Angela Duckworth. She wrote a book really addressing this and kind of looking at and showing research around kind of this grit scale and measuring the grit. She did a number of different studies with different populations, from candidates at West Point to elementary school students, and measuring their grit scale and really defining grit as this idea of passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future day in and day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but years, and really working hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so she really pushes this idea of this hard work and this effort as being the primary kind of indicator of success for people, and kind of that talent. And in this kind of book talks about talent and skill alone are not the only predictors of success. And while this is great, and kind of a lot of the work that she does is really foundational and makes sense, it leaves out a lot to be told about what does this effort mean for people of color, and how does this effort get matched when you think about people of color and their identities, and how that's perceived, that effort is perceived when those identities are acknowledged. And so when reading this, also had to kind of look at Angela Duckworth and say, okay, Angela, we got to reclaim this idea of hard work, because it doesn't acknowledge that the effort that people of color or the work that I put in is not perceived as the same. And so doesn't matter the time or the effort or that ongoing kind of goal, or whatever goal I'm trying to attain, we'll get to that a little later, it is still not necessarily going to end up in this result of success. And so how can we complicate that a little bit more and really look at it with identity at the forefront, as particularly marginal identities?
Because Papa Pope has always said you got to work twice as hard to get half of what they have, and they being acknowledging like white people and the role and power and privilege that they hold within our world. And so yeah, Angela, you can go ahead and say we can do all this work, but also acknowledge that I may work my behind off, but that's only just getting me halfway, sometimes not even halfway, a quarter to where I am trying to get. And so this other piece as it relates to grit is this grit is the concept of grinding, right? And so as people of color, like you grind, you've been told like you need to grind hard to get what you need to get or to accomplish your goals. And so like while Papa Pope talks about this piece, Papa Pope from Scandal talks about this piece of work twice as hard to get half of what they have, but then what, right? And so this concept of grinding, we have been essentially conditioned to constantly grind, and this piece of feeling as though we always have to be busy, and this notion of just pushing through for the sake of accomplishing whatever goal. And so you see on your screen, you may be able to see that there's this image of a ladder leading to what? And so the way in which we went ahead and like kind of defined this as this invisible measuring stick, but acknowledging that this invisible measuring stick is actually a scale of whiteness. And so when we say that we're grinding, what are we measuring ourselves against? And so what are the expectations that one, society puts onto us, particularly what whiteness puts onto us in terms of how we need to show up into the workplace. So all of you all talked about this piece of like professionalism and acknowledging that professionalism is problematic and based off of notions of whiteness. But then also too, thinking about how we have put expectations on ourselves of us having to continue to grind. And so what can we do in being able to disrupt and challenge this piece of the scale that we have no idea that we're even measuring up against, or the scale of like, so what is it going to get us in the end, especially considering that the society that we live in doesn't take into account marginalized identities, and these systems that weren't built for us. So how can we disrupt and challenge ourselves and others within this vicious cycle of trying to measure ourselves up against this stick that we don't even necessarily know what it is?
So kind of transitioning, and as we think about this transition, we really wanted to change this idea around resilience. And we drew kind of our thought and framework of kind of changing the mindset around resilience from liberatory consciousness. And so this idea around liberatory consciousness really involves this idea of kind of recognition and acknowledgement of these kind of systems of oppression, inconsistencies, and really kind of a critical reflection of what is happening. And it involves action and a collective responsibility. And so thinking about all of those things and tenets, how do we, not only as professionals, as practitioners, but as thinking about this for people of color, start to create and redefine spaces of resiliency, or capture what resiliency means in a different way that sits better with kind of our identities, but then also it can, I guess, create a more long-term impact on how we see the things that we're doing, and not in this model of kind of this deficit kind of perspective.
So this deficit perspective, but then also this perspective of achievement, right? Mm-hmm. And so why does our resilience have to be rooted in us accomplishing a goal? And recognizing that there are moments in which life can be very shitty and does not feel good. And that there are moments of us being able to just exist and to just be. And so speaking of just being, that was one of the ways in which we're tossing this idea of resilience and putting it on our heads. And so pretty much acknowledging that this piece of when motivation is not enough and being able to resist this just push through it ideology. And so going back to that concept that we brought up earlier about constantly grinding, and also thinking about this piece of like, at the end of the day, I have to be able to get this in order to accomplish my goal. And in no way are we trying to dismiss the fact that, particularly when you think about our work, bills have to be paid. Something is, if we go ahead and not do or not accomplish this goal, something is going to be lacking, or we're essentially sacrificing something, right? But what does it mean for us to be able to take a pause and acknowledge that there's going to be a moment where just pushing through it is not going to work? And so I actually read this blog post on Twitter about a week ago by Alex C. Lang, who titled it, "This Isn't Working, Resisting, Just Push Through It." And this piece of essentially recognizing, in their post, they talked about, this is verbatim, "So I continue to invest in pushing through because I have this illogical voice in my head that says, if we make it to X date, we'll be fine and we can reassess. And the thing about it is I never reassess. I never make the actual changes I need to make. I allow myself to get confident that I pushed through hard things before. I can do harder things now and continue to test my boundaries of non-sustainable life practices. That's not going to work anymore. I don't have the reserves nor the time to rely on energy that I'm not making and carving out for myself." And they also put in here a specific, like, I cannot wait until October 19th. And so literally acknowledging that this work that we do in terms of showing up, actually doing work and completing tasks is tiring. It's a lot. It takes and drains from us. And when we're constantly, one, trying to measure ourselves up against this, again, this scale of whiteness, two, trying to achieve these goals that of either making ends meet or whatever that may be, it is not allowing ourselves to be able to re-up and be prepared to just push through when we really need to be able to just push through. And so there's other pieces too that we want to dismantle the idea of being our whole authentic selves in the workplace. And so there's this call for us to show up into workspaces being whole and being authentic and being complete. However, that doesn't take into account that, one, space isn't created for us to actually be whole and our authentic selves. And then two, there's a lot of things that are impacting us on a day-to-day basis, given a lot of the things, particularly with the election and number 45, and a lot of decisions and things that are just happening around the world that don't, like, we aren't necessarily whole from those things.
And it's incredibly dangerous and violent to be whole in this time and the reality, and sometimes in thinking about kind of this idea of kind of challenging the notions of sanctuary campuses and safe spaces. Like, it's incredibly violent and dangerous to be whole in some spaces, depending on where you are. And so how do we challenge that a little bit and recognize that not every space is ready or able or has access for people to be in this way? And so until we can dismantle those systems and really create and have access for everyone to show up, how can we allow people to show up as they are?
And also acknowledging too that this piece of whole implies that if you're not whole, you're not seen as resilient. And so what does that mean, and how does that complicate the ways in which, one, as a profession, we talk about this piece of being vulnerable, and this idea that, and recognizing that vulnerability is not something that is accessible or something that people of color want to engage in, because vulnerability is something that is earned through trust and something that is given, not something that should be expected.
And I think we think about, so Brene Brown really talks about vulnerability and showing up and how, like, people need to be brave and this is how you succeed, and doesn't account for the challenges and complications that happen. And while they acknowledge that there's power dynamics and vulnerability and things, don't really account for the challenges and the systems of oppression that consistently impact people of color, people from marginalized spaces in doing that work. And so how do we, like, dismantle this binary and allow people to just exist and not put a spectrum or a measurement to it, and kind of create just not even create, just be.
And this just being, not being rooted in excellence. I like to talk about how I am someone that can, the things that I do and the things that I'm about and the things that I touch puts about this piece of excellence. But part of that is also acknowledging that there are moments in which whatever your, like, excellence is, maybe someone's good. And so what does it mean to be good? Or what does it mean to feel as though, like, you don't have to have gotten 100% on something, or for you to have obtained or to be the top of whatever, but this piece of, like, hey, I sent an email today and that is okay. Or, hey, the fact I actually was able to show up to work today after all this crap that is going on into the world, that being this concept of just being. And so we talk about just being as this form of deep conditioning.
So I came up with this idea, and so deep conditioning is kind of a process in which you kind of, when you deep condition, like your hair, you're putting on a deep conditioner, you put it on, you sit, and you just let it be. You don't have any expectations. You kind of go about, you're carefree, and you kind of wait to see what comes. You don't wait. You, like me, I deep condition for about a couple days, a week at a time. There's no end, there's no result, there's just, it's a kind of a pause. And so when I think about this idea of being, I thought about kind of thinking about resiliency in this, another way to think about it as deep conditioning, right? And how do we allow time for deep conditioning of ourselves and what this looks like, and not feeling like that is measured or needs to have some type of particular outcome. And we saw this really adorable picture, so we had to include it. But I offer that as another way to think about just being as a way of a process that doesn't have an end result, but it also acknowledges that there's work or something that needs to happen, or a point of reflection.
Yeah, and there's other piece in terms of deep conditioning you think about is like sometimes it's not in our control. And so you may want this really bomb twist out, or you really may want these like bomb Bantu knots, and recognizing that you may go ahead and deep condition and you go ahead and put your set style up. And sometimes they don't come out the way as fleeky as you would want them to be. And being okay with the fact that that's okay. And being able to just be in like whatever adjustment that sometimes you may need to make. So, hey, it may be that you putting your putting your twist out into a ponytail, or you readjust, or just leave it as it is. Because again, who is to say that your twist out isn't fleeky? Again, you're measuring your twist out or your success or your being based off of something else. And in this case, it's always whiteness. So when do we essentially say whiteness, like, go to hell?
And we know this is radical, this is challenging, and something that is hard to wrap our brains around, but when we think about and start to unpack resilience in this way, what does this look like? And so it's really exciting to think about the possibilities for not only marginalized identities, but I think about just the work and kind of the change in the work if we start to think about these processes also in this terms of resilient work. And then kind of also thinking about resiliency as this proclamation of joy and celebrating the community and work that we do. So the butter and the sugar of our presentation. And so really focusing on the celebration and championing what we do. And so survival not as the only form of thriving, but really talking about the things that we find joy in, and the things that we do in our work, and kind of highlighting the successes and not feeling like that measurement of success is something that we have to, as a scale out there. It's determined through our own self-reflection. It is thinking about joy and this proclamation of joy as radical self-care. So I think Audre Lorde said it best: caring for myself is not self-indulgent. It is self-preservation, and that it is an act of political warfare. And so when we think about changing this narrative of resiliency, we offer this idea of looking at it as proclaiming our joy and celebrating the work and things that we do, and talking about that as resiliency. And what does that mean for ourselves, the care that we have, but then also just for our overall kind of beinghood and community. I think it's pretty powerful to think about this radical idea, and it changes this idea of a deficit and really empowers people to think about resiliency in a new way and try to define what success means for them in those spaces.
Mm-hmm. And also, it's a call to us to be able to celebrate the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, and celebrate the fact that we are magic, right? Celebrate the fact that we, as Shonda talks about, being badasses. And this piece of like, don't call me lucky, I'm a badass. And the fact that me being able to do X, Y, and Z is amazing, it is brilliant, it is magical, it is triumphant. And not allowing ourselves to get into this mindset of that we don't deserve, one, the recognition that we should get, but then two, acknowledging that we often don't take the time to create space for us to uplift others and call out or show and showcase the amazing things that we are doing in our work as practitioners. And so when you think about Kendrick Lamar's song, Sit Down, Be Humble, no, don't sit down and don't be humble sometimes, right? And so when we aren't necessarily given space in the first place, part of that is us being able to take that space and celebrate and acknowledge and just acknowledge what we have done and what we are doing. And
it's not taking space. I think it's just asserting our role and kind of the things that we do, and kind of thinking about showing that there's this other side to how people live, right? It's not just these hardships. It's not just this overcoming of obstacles. It's these moments of triumph. It's these celebrations, these successes. This is this like living and existing in these moments of joy that really push us forward and push us through whatever we're doing, or push us in whatever we're doing. And that's also a powerful thing that we need to consider.
Cool. And so when we think about implications for our work, so part of it is, so we talk about this particularly in terms of how this shows up for people of color, particularly within the profession, but what does this also mean in terms of us supporting our students, especially our marginalized students and our students of color, in terms of how they're able to show up at our institutions, how they show up in life, and being able to be mindful of how we oftentimes place onto them these goals or these measurements of success, and that we just want them to be able to just be, and not fully feel as though this piece of survival is their only way of being able to thrive, but being able to take joy in the work that they do, even if they think that that work is minor or minuscule.
Mm-hmm. And how do we not engage in this idea of generational trauma that talks about our work from a deficit lens? And so thinking about this empowerment and care and joy and talking about those successes and furthering that narrative and being louder about those things that we do. And so not giving the opportunity for white people or others to automatically default to this narrative of our struggle or this narrative of these hardships, and thinking about people of color in general or marginalized folks in general as the default way that we attained or we got to these spaces.
And we recognize that part of this too is this piece, it's a protection mechanism. It's this way of us being able to support each other as we navigate this thing that we call life in this world that we live in. And at the same time, how are we reinforcing this deficit lens and this deficit model that the work that we do is going to be, yes, it is going to be difficult, but how can we transform that narrative? And so then finally, going back to what I talked about again earlier about this piece of this invisible measuring stick. And so how do we acknowledge that excellence and success isn't the only goal, as achievements are rooted in whiteness? And so, as I stated before, if the fact that you showed up for work is an accomplishment in itself, that is an accomplishment. And it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted on the scale of excellence, on the scale of an accomplishment. That really rethinking and returning this idea of what actually, one, is success, and then two, what does it mean to be successful, and how this idea of how we get to that.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we have some homework for you. And so thinking about kind of further, we wanted to start the conversation. We know that we only have an hour and there's a lot of kind of like excitement around this topic, but really as we start to think about and change this narrative, we really encourage you all were attracted to this presentation, but encourage you all to go back and think about what gives you joy, not tied to anybody in particular or kind of contingent on any one person. What gives you joy?
What gives you joy, Caress?
I just think bright colors.
Bright colors?
Seeing bright colors, seeing flowers, those things bring me joy. So I think my environment, and so having those physical things bring me joy.
I'll say for me, definitely is Japanese anime. So anybody that knows who I am knows that I am a big dork, big geek, and I love Japanese anime. And it's something that I'm really able to really immerse myself in. And I'm not concerned about the way in which I am performing or the way in which I look and the way in which I'm engaging with this, or if it's going to be measured off this thing of success. And so it allows me to be able to be myself without worrying about what other people think. And yeah, it's like, hey, if I want to binge watch some anime all day, yep, that's me. I'm just being, and I may get super geeky about it, and Caress may look at me like, what are you talking about? But that doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, her questioning me is not, my joy is not predicated off of her questioning what gives me joy.
And so sitting and really doing that work, I think, can start to help you uncover and think about how you can use that to start to create your own method of resilience and build your own pathway to thinking about your own resilience, and thinking about also what are some formal and informal ways we can celebrate each other, right? There are lots of awards within our different
knowledge communities and groups and organizations.
I think those are very formal ways, but informally, how do we shout out and celebrate and talk about the things that we do and not feel that we're boasting or taking up space? I think we need to highlight and shout out and say yes to the things that are going on for our profession, for our colleagues, because it's not being talked about. And if we don't talk about it, who will?
Mm-hmm. And my call to white folks, part of that is involving you. You all are also involved in that process too, and acknowledging that, okay, yes, we may be people of color, and yes, we may be navigating the systems of oppression that may not allow us to walk and show up in the ways in which you are able to do, because that's, you know, that's called white privilege. Part of that is you being able to highlight and really give ownership to the fact of the work that we do, and not diminishing it as if, one, we're lucky, or if two, oh, that's cute. No, not as, yeah, I may be cute, but I'm also like a badass too.
And so also thinking about just sitting in, how do we create a sense of community that makes it easier for us to reach out to one another and let each other know that we're struggling with the intimate parts of ourselves, that we can share our vulnerability and hurt more freely with one another. And so really thinking about this idea of when we do need that space, and where does that exist, and how does that exist, and how do you give access or allow that to be, or engage in that yourself. I think there's some toxicity in some of the spaces that are given or created. And so just thinking about that a little bit more critically is something that we want people to consider. And as we think about resiliency and building that a new way to look at it, this is a part of that.
And so it is 1:43. We wanted to make sure that we allowed you all the opportunity to ask us any questions, make comments, bring up additional points, share with us how you celebrate joy and how you celebrate others, and really thinking about this idea of resilience and grit and putting it on our head, putting it on its head, especially through a liberatory consciousness frame. And so we leave you with this picture here of Caressa and I looking so carefree and being so carefree and just being.
Yes. And our joy.
And our joy. Snapchat filters and all.
Yep.
And so at this time, we want to open it up for comments, additional questions, anything that you all want us to further elaborate on or put out there.
So if you do have a question, feel free to click on that questions tab and send your question. I'll go ahead and read it off to our presenters. We do just have an affirmation for you, Kirby, of yes to the anime. So you're not alone in your.
Yes. All righty. Yes. And cheese grits for the win. All righty. I'm glad that we are in solidarity there.
So someone did ask, what anime are you currently watching, Kirby?
Yes, I appreciate this just being. I am currently watching the 3rd season of Shokugeki no Soma. It's actually a cooking anime where they're like really intense in terms of like what they're like cooking, and getting these like shokugekis, which are these battles in terms of them competing against each other, of being able to actually stay in school and not get expelled. So that's one of the animes that I'm recently watching.
Someone else asked, what is something you do every day that brings you joy? So you can't binge watch it every single day, Kirby, I imagine. What else are you doing that's bringing you joy?
I think I wake up and just find a song that is like powerful for my week, and just start my morning, or take up at least a minute or two to dance and like just exist. I might close my office door, but sometimes I leave it open and people look at me weird. But I think it is just having that moment just to like not think about anything and just like enjoy music. I think music is really powerful to me, I think, and others. And so just really enjoying music and either starting my day or taking a moment to pause and find some joy in that is something I do.
I'm gonna be fully transparent and also be vulnerable, very vulnerable with you all now. This is something that I'm still figuring out. And I think about that because I am someone that measures my success based off of the excellence that I do put out into this world. And oftentimes I have essentially equated my joy to doing work. And so this concept of being able to hear this hum, there's this concept, as Chanda talks about, this concept of being able to hear this hum, be able to do this work, being a badass, what am I gonna accomplish next? And I'm really still navigating this piece of like, what does it mean for me to just be? What does it mean for me to not feel as though I have to show up every day and put on this front of being, as some of my colleagues like to call me, the infamous KRG. It's tiring being the infamous KRG, whatever that means, right? And so I appreciate you all asking that question, because it definitely is putting me in this place, and I'm in this reflective space at this moment of really figuring out what that joy means for me, that's not rooted or predicated off of anyone else in terms of me doing something for anyone else, but really solely for me. So thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions that came in. So first, just want to pass along an affirmation from Marissa, who just says, great presentation. But then also from Corinne Dyer, how do you or can you develop liberatory consciousness in celebrating among your colleagues? So how do you do this? What does this look like in practice for you all?
Ooh, good question.
That is. I think it's trying to involve, how do you involve your colleagues in this process, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think about the collective responsibility. And so I think for me, it's tapping my friend Kirby and saying, hey, this resiliency thing, it's kind of, I don't get it. And having this dialogue and thinking about what we can do, and not only talking to you all on the webinar, but what are some ways that we can work together and thinking about this differently in our work. Is it, do we need to have a space? Do we not have the space? And kind of just that coming together, I think is really powerful, and just talking it out, because I don't know if we give space to that.
Mm-hmm. I think the other piece too is, so I'm not sure if any of you all are familiar with love languages, and being able to acknowledge the way in which people like to receive some form of affirmation or some form of recognition in this celebration piece. And so for me, one of my biggest things is quality. My love language is quality time and acts of service. But that may not necessarily be the case for your colleague who actually appreciates words or affirmation, or this piece of physical touch, or did I list all 5 of them? I think I did. Yeah. And so one, giving space for folks to, one, be able to share how they like to be celebrated, and then 2, being able to think about the ways in which they don't have to be major, and they can be something that's just as small as saying like, yo, this presentation that we did today, Caress, is pretty much bomb. And I'm like very privileged and honored to be able to present with you be on the side of you to be able to present this, right? And so little things like that goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Great. So our next question is from Tranquility, and they say, I feel like many of us are so far behind in this endeavor. What's the first step to reframing the narrative when you're at a PWI with little support in your department and struggling to find joy in your work?
Woo! That's the question.
$1 million question.
That's the $1 million question. I think we have to go back to what we said before, is so we are not saying that we have the $1 million answer to this, right? And so we want to acknowledge and say that, like, life is rough, and like the things that you all are experiencing in your workplace, in your lives, is not necessarily going to go away immediately just by like going to sleep and then waking up the next day.
Yeah, I just think about how, like, I guess where to start is, have you taken the time to pause and assess what's going on and really look at it, right? Not say it's overwhelming, it's hard, oh, this sucks, but really look at it and think about where you stand and what's happening in your spaces, right? And so I think it is kind of maybe starting there and kind of reflecting on what you need, because I think too that's important, of that it's a self-reflective process. And so what do you need in that pause, but then also I think it's reaching out to colleagues across. I think being at a PWI is hard, and so if I didn't tap other people that look like me, or like talk to other people across the university, and I know it's hard and you see them, but tracking them down, I think that is also a way to start to think about different ways of getting that feedback and kind of listening to others too.
And I would say too, not limiting your tribe to where you are currently at, and acknowledging your tribe can be expansive and exist across many dimensions of this world. And so whether that be the fact that, so I have my Dungy Leadership Institute 2013 class, folks. And so shout out to y'all, DLI 13, much love. And knowing that I can reach out to them, and the fact that we're all over the country, and being able to chat with them and communicate about what I'm going through, because part of it too is you being able to get another perspective besides what you are currently in. And then I say the other piece too is being able to reevaluate what your values are as they relate to the values of your department and of your institution. And so as a profession, this is another presentation for another day, we talk about this concept of fit. And the way in which I like to think of it as in terms of fit isn't always the truth. And so recognizing that there are pieces of like, there will never be this perfect mold, there will never be this ideal way for you to be able to just be. Because there are ways in which the certain values or decisions that may be made by an institution or department affects the way in which you show up. And so if you are having visceral reactions, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, whatever that means, that's an indication to me that you need to get out of there, right? Still being realistic and being mindful that, hey, me trying to find a job right now is not necessarily the option at that moment. And still being able to utilize those other resources that Caress also brought up in terms of connecting with your tribe and connecting with other people as well.
Thanks, y'all. Something I think is important with this, and Marissa also asked us, is how does social media play into resilience and grit, and how that maybe manifests for itself?
It's funny because we talked about that.
We did.
And it was like, that was a whole nother presentation, because I think I think when I acknowledge the toxicity in kind of some of the spaces of vulnerability, I think social media is one of those. And thinking about how people show up and extend and ask for help, but then also how like people are dragged for whatever they post or how they show up in these spaces.
Yeah, and we as a profession, as a field, I'm gonna go ahead and call this out again. We allow the way in which we show up in social media spaces to essentially, it's pretty much an attack on the way in which we do show up. And so the fact that we have to be mindful of the way in which what we post on our accounts and like who we engage with, and like the fact that if I go ahead and express my opinion, there's this high probability of me losing my job, like that totally impacts the way in which you are able to show up and just be. And so I think, one, we have to be mindful of the messages that we're giving out as a field, as in terms of like how you show up in terms of social media spaces. But then also too, from a user standpoint, how do you know when to just log off? Because the way in which we are engaging with social media now is that there's this, particularly given the government and our president, like there's no boundaries at all. And we are being traumatized and triggered by a number of different things that are happening on the internet. And so what does it mean for you to be able to take a social media hiatus and not give in to the mess that is social media sometimes?
And I think even with social media, kind of understanding and recognizing its power and the privilege that comes with accessing it, and challenging the people who like really police and engage, and really just blocking them, right? Using that block button real hard and saying like, not up in
not
my
today.
face. By Satan.
By Felicia.
But I think about the power and privileges that people use and access with commenting on articles and doing that, and how you can easily block and kind of cut that out of your feed, and how that is necessary sometimes to kind of as self-preservation, but then also just thinking about those boundaries and how do we set boundaries in social media spaces, and who polices those boundaries. And I think it's up on ourselves to dictate that for ourselves.
Because people would like to just troll, y'all. People just troll the troll. And so being able to acknowledge that we can't control for that, because that one requires us to really unpack this piece of like all of the isms that exist in the world. And we are definitely not there at all whatsoever.
But yeah, that's a good topic though. Like,
you want to present with us, whoever's posed that question?
We're gonna put that in the other space for later.
Yes.
I believe it was Caress who mentioned this earlier, and this idea of generational trauma, when we're trying to rewrite our narrative, especially getting away from a deficit model. Someone asked a question I think is related. On another level, do you think resilience takes on a different meaning across different generations? So how do we experience this differently depending on our age, or kind of where we think that we fit in our generational categories?
That is a good question, because I think it does sit differently thinking it generationally, because I think about just how we, like, as generations function and absorb and handle and manage this feedback and what in the world that we're in. And so kind of, I think how do I say this? Like, what am I trying to say? Pause.
Pause.
I think it does matter, and I think it also goes back to this idea of how do we allow space for people to write that for themselves and not create these measurements or scales of success that are loosely applied to everyone, right? And so when we're talking about resiliency, we, on each of our new ideas, we're talking about this kind of self-reflective, self-created model and this self-responsible, initiated practice. And so in kind of applying this generationally, I think there are definitely some nuances and differences, but I think how do you allow for that and also understand that this is a process for your own self?
And I think too, there's this piece of acknowledging kind of where we've gone, like where we've been and kind of where we've gone, where we're going. And so thinking about generations, of thinking about the boomers and thinking about our people that and ancestors that have come before us, this piece of like, we shall overcome, this piece of grinding and pushing through, like given the times, like that's still what, like, that was what they had to do in that moment. And even then, it's still something that we have to do in that moment, but also still being mindful of like, while we may be trying to set each other up for success and set each other up for success, and I put that in quotes, and being a resource and helpful, what harm is that actually really doing in not allowing us to be able to write those narratives for ourselves by essentially being able to saying that this is the narrative in which you need to subscribe to, and this is how you survive, and this is how you survive through that narrative.
I don't know if we answered your question. We tried. If we didn't, feel free to email, tweet. We can talk.
I think we have time for one last question. Someone asked, what programs have you done to develop grit? And I would expand this to, how do you practice grit while still being conscious of your own well-being?
Gotcha. And so I just had the opportunity of being surrounded in a very powerful space with 36 other individuals at our Students of Color Leadership Retreat that we have here at Syracuse University. And so I had the privilege of presenting with one of my good friends, Wendy Martinez, on this concept of embracing badassery. And so it's reclaiming my time, embracing badassery. And so what we essentially did for this presentation is that we talked about this piece using Shonda Rhimes' Year of Yes, and talked about this piece of like getting folks to actually stand up in front of one another and celebrate each other. So one, you doing your own self-reflection and taking a selfie, so to speak, of like what makes you a badass, and acknowledging how you got there and how you persevered and how you developed that grit, and then being able to share that with everybody else and us being able to also celebrate. And so I think there's this piece of like, it's a combination of developing grit, but then also going back to this new model or this new approach that Caressa and I are talking about with really thinking about the celebration and this joy of being badasses and acknowledging, yeah, we went through X to get to where we're at.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kirby and Caressa, for a great session today. Seriously, a phenomenal thing. As you all are done with your presentation, look on the back channel. I think people definitely were having some great conversations. They're saying hello to everyone who's able to see the screen. Thank you all so much. And a big thank you to everyone who joined. This webinar was recorded and is going to be available via the Suzanne webpage once it's edited in November. Our next webinar is tomorrow, Wednesday, October 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and that's more to it than volunteering, considerations for a career path in civic learning and democratic engagement. We hope you'll join us for that as well. So again, tweet at Kirby and Caressa if you want to continue the conversation. Lots of good stuff to dig into. But thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
See ya. Bye.